Thank you very much. That was a really very good speech, thought-provoking. I'm keen to pick up where you left off with your last point about how the young people want more opportunities to have their say and be heard. You gave a couple of examples. It seems to me that in order to have that opportunity, they have to make it rather than wait to be asked. Is that a fair interpretation of what you were saying?
I think that's the state of things at this stage. I think that there are lots of young people who are really stepping out of what's expected of a young person in the media and in the public to make a positive contribution, even if they don't realise it. I think there's a lot of young people who make really meaningful change in their communities without really realising the impact that they're having. And perhaps they won't realise until they're older. I don't know. But I think that there is a lack of formal avenues to have your voice heard in this country. And I'd like to this year, continue speaking with young people and exploring ways in which we can cultivate that. I caught myself just then. I was about to say a generation of emerging leaders, but that would contradict what I said just before. A generation of young leaders. Young people are already leading in their community.
I guess the examples you give are from young people who are highly motivated to make change, which is so amazing to see. So I think formal avenues is a good idea. You spoke about some examples you've heard of in your listening tour so far. I'm just wondering if you could expand on a few. You said lots of different people have started their own things. Can you expand on some that really struck a chord with you?
Yeah, it's interesting. In UN Youth, we hear about innovative solutions to issues that young people come up with all the time. In fact, we run a public speaking competition for young people called Voice, and what they're required to do is they're required to provide a solution to an issue, and we want solutions that are novel and interesting, that's the public speaking, that's their speech. It's presenting almost like a, I don't know if you remember the TV show The New Inventors on ABC. I used to love it when I was like a little nerdy 11-year-old. But people would come in and give a pitch about an invention. It's basically like that, but it's a public speaking competition for years 7 to 10. We do that around the country. We've heard some great stuff during, in that competition. And it's a really accessible competition, which I'm really proud of. It's great that we get a variety of different young people involved with that. But over the years, I've heard innovative solutions to mental health awareness in the community. We had one girl a couple of years ago actually create armbands for people, and she'd give them away, and it was a they served as reminders for of people who suffered from mental health in the community. It shows sign of solidarity. We had another young person who made an app that raised awareness about mental health. And then, even when I mean, one of the best parts is when I go into a school, or when UN Youth goes into a school, we run a workshop, or we do a consultation, and just in that 45 minutes or 3 hours, depending on who we're talking to, the young people will come up with a solution. Like while we're there, they identify an issue that they care about. We tell them, well, what are we going to do about it? What resources do you have? Who can assist you in this journey? And then we have all these solutions that young people come up with, and that's what's motivated me, all these years to eventually find myself in this position. Is that young people's perspective? Young people are, I think we are naturally very idealistic, and that's a really good thing. It's important that we have visionaries, and I think that young people are the visionaries of this country. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you've only been on this listening tour for a month, but what are the biggest issues that you've been hearing over that month? Are they recurring issues or themes that are most important to young people?
Yeah, there are trends so far, and I suppose at the end of the year we'll get a much clearer picture once we deliver our report back. But for example, I was at a conference run by UN Youth New South Wales a couple of weeks ago. We divided young people into groups, and in those groups, they had to identify the issue that mattered most to that group of young people, and there needed to be consensus in order to move forward. And we had 200 young people there, and I reckon 10 out of 15 groups identified mental health without talking to one another. They all identified mental health as an issue that they care about. And I think when I look at other issues that young people are raising with me so far, they're all connected to mental health and to well-being. Discrimination, stigma, racism, even things like unemployment, drugs and alcohol abuse, they're all connected to the well-being of young people and the well-being of the community. And as I said before, the well-being of the broader community hinges on how our young people are doing in the community. And it's important that we ensure that young people are being valued, because we all suffer if they're not.
I'm not sure if in your conversations with these young people about mental health, whether there have been practical solutions. I mean, it's such a massive problem and seems to be getting worse. Has there anything concrete come out of it, or is it too hard?
It sounds like young people are really yearning for cultural change. I'm hearing words like discrimination, like stigma, a lot. And I'm hearing from young people who feel as though there's negative connotations attached to mental health in the community. So I think that the biggest solution so far has been talking to people, talking to your peers, to your family members, to older people in the community, making sure that we are able to change in that way. In terms of tangible policy, perhaps not yet, but I'm pretty confident that I'll hear some pretty innovative solutions this year. Yeah.
Do you think that some of that stems from social media and people living a lot more of their lives online?
Social media is a big thing that young people are talking about, but not necessarily negatively. So I have heard a lot about the negative implications of excessive social media use or cyberbullying, and they're all really important conversations to have. But, you know, the generation that we have who are currently in high school, they are the most technologically savvy generation in history. And I see technology being used in such incredible ways every day. We've got organisations like change.org that actually have, online petitions actually do have an impact. I'm sure everyone in this room has signed at least one online petition in their life. They make a change. And even things like, Facebook and Twitter have the ability to change people's perspectives. I've never bought the idea that using social media is an active, is an antisocial act, which I think is something that we tell young people all the time. I think that it's about celebrating and embracing the positive parts of technology and the positive aspects of social media, whilst also educating young people about, the inherent dangers as well. That's really important.
So I think young people can unfairly sometimes be accused of apathy when it comes to policy and things that are happening around them.
Yeah.
Do you feel like young people are becoming more connected? And I'm wondering whether you think that might have been given a boost during the same-sex marriage vote, where we saw a lot of young people register their details to vote. Do you think that's made a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I saw the statistics of how many young people voted in the postal survey, and that's fantastic. I despair sometimes at the thought that some young people don't realise that, at 18 you really need to enrol, and the importance of having your voice heard as well. I think young people can feel disconnected from politics a lot because the stories that we hear in the news are often not about policy. They're about shenanigans that happen down the corridors of Canberra. And I think young people have a radar on these things. I was going to use a word before radar, but I won't use that, but you probably know what I'm talking about. I think young people have an ability to see something and realise that it's a bit bogus. And I think that leads to young people tuning out from politics. So I was delighted to see that lots of young people participated in that survey, and now they're enrolled, which is great. So the next federal and state elections will see a really high turnout of young people, and that's fantastic, regardless of who they vote for. Yeah.
So following on from that, do you think that leaders at the moment take into account the views of young people when developing policy?
No. I think that that's one of the key messages this year is I want to know what Australia would look like if young people had a greater say. I think that we need to bring young people to the table in these important decisions. Because as I said before, young people are not immune to issues that affect the community, and youth issues affect the whole community as well. Everything is interconnected. Young people do participate in everyday life in Australia. So why don't we include them in obviously in a way that's appropriate? Let's not have a quota of 50% politicians under the age of 10. Like, that wouldn't work. That'd be so cool to see, like young children politicians. No. We need to develop formal mechanisms. We put formal mechanisms in place to ensure that young people's perspectives are adequately considered. And perhaps at the end of this year, we'll get a clearer picture of what that could look like.
Yeah, I guess that comes back to the earlier question about the formal avenue, and touching slightly on the politicians, 10-year-old politicians. But we saw White Roy, who was quite young. Do you think there needs to be more young people in politics to represent the views of young people?
That's a really good question. I think that, it's always great to have young representation in politics. And I think that's a really positive thing, and it also means that young people are able to see a leader, a politician, and identify with them in that way. There's a lot of other things at play as well, isn't there? Australians have long derided the high school, uni, staffer, advisor, politician path that some politicians take. And good on them, but there's something to be said about gaining particular skills, gaining life experiences. These are things that we do need to take into consideration. I think that we need to look beyond just trying to get young people winning seats. I think that the politicians that we do have need to actually ensure that their young people, the young constituents and their electorates, are being heard and being considered. And
I guess on this listening tour, is there a story that is you did share quite a few in your speech there, but is there a story that's really struck you personally or inspired you personally, anything like that?
It's a really hard question, Catalina, because a lot of the time, sometimes, I'll hear something and I'll be like, that's great. And then a week later, suddenly something will come to me and I'll get a moment of clarity and realise how incredible that perspective was. And I'm having those moments a lot. I'm hearing so many different perspectives that are really interesting. I think the really awe-inspiring ones are the stories of new Australians, of children of immigrants or young immigrants as well. We had a young person. Oh, that's coming off my ear. Come back. There we go. Never worn one of these before. All right. I received a statement from a young person from Victoria a couple of months ago, and she was calling for an acknowledgement of the fantastic work that immigrants do and provide in the Australian community and the skills that they bring to this country. She was talking about how she arrived to Australia with her parents when she was a child with, only a few $1,000s, and they started their life from scratch. And let's not forget in those stories that there's often, in those stories of parents, coming over and starting a new life, there's children in that picture as well, and the children are being impacted by the same things but in a different way. And I thought, I like hearing those stories because I think we need to hear more of them. As a fifth generation South Australian, these are stories that aren't familiar to me. So I'm learning so much all the time, and I'm drawing a lot of strength from, the young people of colour in particular who are sharing stories of, escaping danger, but also facing discrimination in this country as well. I've heard some really sobering stories over the last few weeks of young people in this country who aren't being treated like citizens, aren't being treated like the way they should be treated. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of those stories and showcasing them in the role.
That must be quite sobering for you to listen to, as you say, the fifth generation South Australian, because we keep being told that Australia is the most successful multicultural society, but yet you obviously hear lots of stories about discrimination.
Well, I'm hearing that as well from these young people. I'm also hearing a lot of the young people that have talked to me so far in the listening tour are telling me these stories of discrimination, but also telling me stories about how positive they see Australia's multicultural society. And I think perhaps these young people who've lived in two different environments can speak to that much better than I ever can as a white Australian. The state of affairs, I suppose, the state of race relations and multiculturalism in Australia. So this role is such a learning experience for me as well. I feel incredibly privileged to be in a position to have young people tell me these really personal stories about their lives. I don't take that lightly, at least I try not to take that lightly.
And I know this is the question that you've been asking all other young people. What would Australia look like if young people were given a greater say? I hope you don't mind if I ask you that question.
I think that if young people had a greater say, we'd have better policies. I think that we'd have greater consensus amongst Australians, amongst our citizens. I think that Australia would be a better place in any environment, in a school, in a university, in a workplace. If you involve young perspectives, you're going to make it a better environment for not just those young people, but everyone as well. Because the well-being of our young people affects the whole community.
I'm wondering whether, and I will open it to question and answers soon, because I'm sure there's plenty of questions out there as well, but I'm just wondering whether generational theft or unfairness has been raised, because we know wages aren't growing quickly, that's across the board, but obviously young people fall victim to that too. Hard to get a job, hard to get into the housing market, especially here in Sydney. And this sense that, the older people have had it easy and have got these great tax breaks. Is there resentment, or has that been raised at all?
Perhaps not as much as older Australians might think. I think that young people so far have been quite conscious of the support that they have, that young people do receive from the rest of the community. No doubt housing and cost of living are big issues for young people, especially in the eastern states, especially so in Sydney. Yeah, I think I'm going to hear more of that throughout the year. I think it's a little bit early to say. But so far, I think that there hasn't been too much of a degree of animosity towards older, the older generations. No.
Good to hear.
Yeah.
And I'll just name a couple of other issues as well, just out of curiosity whether it has been raised.
Yeah.
Republic, climate change, is that on young people's radar?
Climate change so far, yes. Republic, no. I don't think I've heard someone talk about a republic yet, but I do know that there are lots of young people who care about the Republican movement in Australia, and no doubt I'll hear from those young people at some point. Yeah.
And just lastly from me before I hand it over to you, I'm just curious to know what's next for you. You're only 22. You're doing great things.
Thank you.
Could politics be in your future?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that I've always had a passion about policy that improves people's lives. If I can play a role in creating effective and meaningful policy in the future, I think I'll be happy, whatever form that is. But entering politics is not something that I have as a goal of mine at the moment, no.